hand over to John to introduce Joe.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I've known Joe since, and I think this is right, 2008, when he had the misfortune of being taught by me as a first-year undergraduate. Joe was the first-year undergraduate, not me. All the evidence suggests that he's since made a full recovery from that experience. Like a bishop on a chessboard, and I should say that I think Joe's like a bishop on a chessboard only in the following respect. Joe's academic career has sort of followed a kind of diagonal line from the southwest to the northeast of England. So he grew up in the southwest, did his first degree at Oxford, went back southwest to Exeter for an MA, to Oxford again for a PhD on work that was related to the Stuart Successions project, to Cambridge for a junior research fellowship, and he's now academic track fellow in English literature at Newcastle University. So while moving in this episcopal way across the country, Joe has found some time to do some research, quite a lot of research. And sometimes I think someone should probably stop him. And the problem for me isn't just the quantity, but the relentless quality of the research. So Joe works on late 17th and 18th century literature and politics, broadly speaking. He's got strong interests in the book trade in that period. He's also a scholarly editor. He's published articles on Pope, on Defoe, on Bolingbroke, on the publishing of Whig political thoughts, on Isaac Newton's role in the production of medals commemorating Queen Anne, on Johnson's Shakespeare, and much more. And if that wasn't enough, he's also written 3 books, the latest of which we think comes out in about a fortnight. And so I would take that level of productivity as a personal affront if it weren't for 2 factors. According to Google Scholar, Joe has cited my work more frequently than anyone else in the world, a staggering 5 times, which is remarkable given that there's not that much to choose from, to be honest. And Joe charges hardly anything for that service. He's also very nice. That's the other factor, which is why I hope I've been able to get away with pretending to be rude, nice and kind and generous. And I can't remember seeing him be anything but cheerful. He's collegial. He's interested in fostering collegiality, as evidenced by the excellent and really welcoming symposium on literature in the early modern state he organised a couple of years ago. So he's right at home in this lovely ODSECS community, and thanks again to Rebecca for keeping that going. Joe's first book, Literature and Party Politics at the Accession of Queen Anne, was shortlisted for the 2019 University English Book Prize, and he was robbed. I hope the person who won isn't here. That would be awkward. It's characteristic of Joe's work, I think, in its combination of a tight historical or evidential focus with a sort of easy grasp of the bigger picture and the ways in which that tight focus can make us see that picture differently. And in this case, he does it by taking us through different stages of Anne's coronation or accession, relatively understudied as coronations go, and demonstrating what those moments and the text produced in them can reveal about the sort of present tense party political scene and vice versa, while not forgetting to give due attention to the complexity of those texts. And I think there's a really brilliant reading of Defoe's Shortest Way with the Dissenters in the book that does precisely those 2 things, not quite at the same time, but in one chapter. And I think the book's particularly good at opening up and encouraging us to open up the heterodoxy of groups or movements we sort of fall into using as a kind of shorthand, like Jacobitism, which Joe argues is both more widespread and more confused than is sometimes thought. And incidentally, more widespread and more confused seems like a good slogan for our current times, which is not to say that we should all embrace Jacobitism. More recently, Joe published, hang on, I need to get my prop. The Paper Chase, here it is, a book written for a more general audience, if that were possible, and narrating the goings-on surrounding the pamphlet, the Memorial for the Church of England. And I'm ashamed to say I've not yet read it, but I hope Joe will agree that what really matters is that I've bought it for a very reasonable price. In a couple of weeks, we may or may not be able to get our hands on Alexander Pope in the Making, Joe's 3rd book from OUP, which promises a new and closely contextualized reading of Pope's early career, and which I imagine is a bit less reasonably priced, but I'm sure we'll all cope. Joe's currently editing Pope's early poems for the new Oxford edition and co-editing an essay collection, Jonathan Swift in Context, the CUP, but more pressingly, he is here to talk to us, and his title is Secrets, Lies, and Title Pages. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, John, for that immensely kind and slightly daunting introduction, very few words of which I think are deserved. And thanks to Rebecca and to all of you for taking time out of your day to come along to what could, I'm sure, seem like a rather unpromising, dare I say, dry topic. But there will, I hope, nonetheless be something over the next half hour that everybody, even the most bibliophobic of 18th centuryists, might be able to take away from it. So I'm just going to share my screen now. I'm assuming that you, and I'm going to plow straight ahead into the talk. So around about this time last year, I was trying to get my head around a puzzle. Upstairs in the British Library, in my usual seat in rare books, which is 270 for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing, I had the following pamphlet in front of me. ESop at Amsterdam, a short collection of viciously republican fables published in 1698. Now, whenever I'm faced with this kind of anonymous polemical pamphlet, the first question to go through my head is always who could have been responsible for this. And the pseudonym Ludlow Redivivus immediately got my blood pulsing, because earlier in that same year, 1698, appeared one of the most enduringly important books in the canon of Whig political thought, the memoirs of the deceased Ludlow, the deceased regicide Edmund Ludlow. Newly sanitized and sharpened up by that most intriguing and elusive of Whig philosophers, the Irish deist John Toland. So could Toland have been Ludlow Redivivus? While looking at the two books side by side, something else occurred to me. Both claimed to have been printed abroad, but this was manifestly not so. The Amsterdam imprint of the ESop pamphlet's a patent fabrication, printed for Mynheer van den Flounder. I mean, come on. And the second but equally meaningless imprint for the booksellers of London Westminster is as good as a confession here. As for Ludlow's memoirs, nobody bought the whole Switzerland ruse at the time. To quote one contemporary's opinion of that particular imprint, had they said at Derby, it had been nigher home, and nigher truth too, by a little quibbling transition from place to person. According to another riddler, the printer of Ludlow was as well known to the rest of the trade as Derby ale to a toper. In other words, the printer was none other than John Derby, a confirmed radical and Anabaptist operating out of Bartholomew Close near Grub Street. Derby certainly had an appetite for false foreign imprints, particularly Amsterdam imprints. So I thought, could ESop have come from his press too? Confirmation that I was on the right track came when I opened another one of the books on my desk in the BL, the Memoirs of Denzil Hollis, printed by Derby in 1699 as a companion piece to Ludlow. And as you'll see, what immediately jumped out at me is that the ornaments used to decorate the title page were identical to those used for ESop. So I'd solved one puzzle, it seemed. The printer of ESop was, in all likelihood, John Derby. Perhaps his friend and collaborator Toland had written the pamphlets, the fables contained in the ESop pamphlet. Who knows? But the fruits of this research on Derby, as John mentioned, have appeared in an article for the Historical Journal. But for me, this original puzzle had actually been subsumed now by a much larger question. For if everybody knew that Derby was responsible for these pamphlets, then why did he go through the facade of slapping false places, names, dates on title pages? Why the secrets? Why the lies? Well, those are the questions that I want to explore this afternoon. Because all of us who work with 18th century books encounter imprints on a daily basis. We work with them all the time. Whenever we cite a book, we look at its imprint. And so for literary scholars and historians alike, imprints have a certain kind of evidentiary value. Yet we seldom give much thought to the phrasing of the imprint. Beyond thinking about who was the printer, who the bookseller, and who the publisher. And so in this paper, I want to urge all of us to look at imprints in a slightly different light. In short, I want to caution against the use of imprints as a straightforward source of bibliographical information, and instead suggest that we don our literary critical caps and look at them as texts. So before going any further, a quick word about the legal status of the imprint during the 18th century. There's been a good deal of confusion about this over the years, much of which can be resolved fairly easily. An imprint was both a convention and a legal necessity, hence the fact that we encounter them all the time. After the lapse of the Printing Act in 1695, the book trade remained subject to an ordinance stipulating that nobody should print, publish, or retail any book or pamphlet unless such printer or printers as shall print the same do thereunto print his or their name or names, or the name of the bookseller who shall put the same to printing. Failure to comply with that particular regulation incurred a fine of £20. The measure was reinforced with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1712, which mandated that no person whatsoever shall sell or expose to sale any such pamphlet without putting the names and addresses of the persons who truly printed or published it to the title page. Now, naturally, those measures have granted anybody who works with old books a certain degree of reassurance. But of course, printers, like anybody working in a highly regulated industry, were liable to break the law. Sometimes authors sent copy to their printer, complete with a fully worked out imprint. And this is perhaps something I can talk about a bit more later on. Other times, as you can see from this example, from the papers of the bookseller Richard Chiswell, they delegated the phrasing of the imprint to the printer. And usually the imprints for potentially dangerous or controversial books would simply be evasive. So a printer might assign the name of a wholesale distributor, like Abigail Baldwin, as Darby did with John Tutchin's infamous lampoon, The Foreigners. Still more dubiously, some printers would state that a book was simply sold by the booksellers of London, whatever that means, or even, as we see here, provide only the non-committal tag printed in the year. Occasionally, in their desire to remain anonymous, printers could get up to a little mischief, telling prospective buyers that a book was printed for nobody but those who have a mind to read it. False names could be invented easily enough. Perhaps nobody would assume that a triumphant broadside celebrating English military victories over the French had truly been printed for Monsieur de Garlic Pinch at the Tree Flying Frog in Spitter de Field, as the imprint to one 1708 ballad claimed, nor did they necessarily believe in the imprint of A. Moore, a fictitious bookseller whose innuendo-laden name was simultaneously used by several printers across the trade, as Andrew Brick has shown. And yet the more credulous reader might just be fooled into thinking that the numerous libels said to have been printed for J. Smith near Fleet Street, sorry that image isn't too sharp, were indeed printed for a bookseller of that name at that roundabout location. There was in truth no such person. Although an imprint was required on English books by law, a nation's laws extend only so far as its borders, and while the suspected importers of foreign books might be fined for failing to pay cargo duties, and the hawkers of such works could still be prosecuted for distributing seditious libels, there could be no easy investigation into printers working on foreign shores. For this reason, one effective but high-risk strategy for disguising the origins of a book was to print it with a foreign imprint. I've already shown you some false Amsterdam and Switzerland imprints, so for a change, here's an example supposedly from Cologne. Note the elaboration of personal details here. It seems almost superfluous to mention that there was no such person as Dominic Vertel, printer and bookseller. Now, perhaps you may say that you'd never be fooled by one of these examples. Perhaps you're one of those people who's so sufficiently steeped in the controversial literature of the 18th century that you recognize all these tricks. Well, here are a couple of more complex examples. I present to you Thomas Hobbes's masterwork, Leviathan, printed for Andrew Crooke at the Green Dragon in St. Paul's Churchyard, 1651. Except only one of these books was printed in 1651. The other was printed 5 decades later. Care to guess which one? How much would you be willing to stake? Well, thanks to the labours of Noel Malcolm, we know the example on the right, with its arrangement of ornaments, came from the workshop of our old friend John Darby. As you can see, the ornaments match a set which he used elsewhere on clandestine publications. This edition of Leviathan was, in essence, a fake first edition. Here's a very different, but potentially even more disturbing example. In February 1721, the Parliamentary Committee was tasked with investigating the publication of an anonymous work of blasphemy entitled A Sober Reply to Mr. Higgs's Merry Arguments. According to the Imprint, this anti-Trinitarian pamphlet was printed for E. Smith in Cornhill, and so government thugs duly seized the Mercury Elizabeth Smith. On further investigation, though, the bookseller was revealed to have been Thomas Warner, and the printer, a jobbing tradesman called William Wilkin. As for Smith, well, according to the parliamentary records, she positively denied she ever saw the book till the same was showed her by the messenger who took her into custody. Reporting back to Parliament, the committee explained that under examination, Wilkin had confessed that it was a very customary thing in his workshop to put the name of persons to pamphlets who have no concern therein, and that this was, I quote, an arbitrary practice across the industry. Now just let that sink in for a second, because such an assertion ought to be of serious concern to anybody who works with old books. Because if the conventions of the imprint were a mere arbitrary practice, then our understanding of the book trade rests on fragile evidentiary ground indeed. Wilkinsons Confession underscores that the purpose of an imprint could be very different to its overt meaning. A false imprint could contain a true name. For an imprint to claim a book was published by Elizabeth Smith was one thing. For that book to have been published by her is quite another. So when dealing with these kinds of books, it becomes hugely important to distinguish between that which we think we know and that which we actually know. To confuse one for the other is to risk potentially catastrophic error. Okay, so having surveyed the various forms that false imprints could take, I now want to focus on how they could be used to signal a book's ideological commitments. In particular, I want to take a close look at how Amsterdam imprints were used in the English trade. For the use of Amsterdam as a false publication was quite evidently a calculated statement. Partially, this was because the press simply operated under fewer laws in the Dutch Republic, as Charles Blunt explained in the preface to his Anima Mundi, a deistic tract which appeared with the ridiculous imprint Amsterdam Anno Mundi 00000. For hostile English satirists, though, Amsterdam was primarily seen as a den of exiled English radicals who enjoyed relative safety from religious or political persecution under the Dutch Republican government. And so Amsterdam imprints were thought to signify either writings of a Republican or anti-monarchical strain, or free-thinking religious works. Hence John Darby's 1698 edition of Milton's prose writings, including the monarch-bashing Iconoclastes, which appeared with that characteristic Amsterdam imprint. The eagle-eyed among you will have seen that that little ornament on the title page was the same as the one on Tutchin's Foreigners. A Tory visual satire from the next decade latched onto this point. Guess at my meaning shows that Whig bogey Benjamin Hoadley seated at a desk writing a seditious sermon. On the bookshelf behind him is a neatly stacked row of seditious books, most of them Derby publications, Milton, Sidney, Tyndall, Toland, Harrington, Locke, and of course Hobbes. At the bottom right corner of this sheet is a false Geneva imprint, but more overt in its parody was a reworked copy of the engraving, printed with an excerpt from William Shippin's satirical poem Faction Displayed, for which we go down to the bottom. The imprint mockingly reads, engraved and printed at Amsterdam. Now, the ideological component of the imprint is, I think, underscored by a 1714 reissue of But Needham's 1652 Monarchomac pamphlet, A Cat May Look Upon a King. In its original format, this pamphlet had chronicled the corruption and tyranny of English kings since the Norman conquest, arguing for the establishment of a free state. The reissue appeared with the imprint Amsterdam, printed in the glorious year 1714, with a new conclusion that transformed this polemic against Stuart despotism into a defence of the Hanoverian succession. So who printed it? Well, one anonymous respondent attacked the pamphlet on the grounds the dual title pages make as if it was printed at Amsterdam in Holland when it was printed by some factious printer in London, but annoyingly didn't name the suspect. Although the cat appeared with two large woodcuts adorning its dual title pages, they were crudely done, appear nowhere else, and provide no real clue. However, the distinctive phrasing of the imprint was echoed in a new edition of John Cook's King Charles's Case, which was, as you can see here, printed for J.H., a friend to legal monarchy, but an enemy to monarchical tyranny, in the glorious year 1714. Now, this book was quickly condemned as one of two treasonable libels to spring from a particular quarter of the underground press. In an attack on those two pamphlets, a hostile Tory commentator drew attention to the curious wording of this imprint. By legal monarchy, he means a commonwealth, and by monarchical tyranny, any government which is subject to a king, this outraged pamphleteer asserted. Continuing, should any English monarch follow the example of the Stuarts, this printer will be prepared to strike the glorious blow, nay, even in this glorious year. So here we see the imprint being deciphered as a polemical document. Now, the second of these two treasonable libels was John Wing's controversial Reasons Humbly Offered to the Parliament for Abrogating the Observation of the 30th of January, in other words, for abolishing the commemoration of Charles the Martyr. Now, this pamphlet was published anonymously with a dubious Sold by J. Baker imprint, but was truthfully printed by the Quaker printer Samuel Kemmer. Furthermore, Wing's Reasons concludes with a final leaf of advertisements for 3 books, 2 of which we know were printed by Keymer under misleading imprints. And the 3rd advertised volume at the bottom there, well, that's the new edition of the Amsterdam Cat, puffed as a faithful transcript from the best authorities of the lives and deaths of our kings. All these books came from Keymer's workshop. And conclusive evidence that Keymer printed them all comes in the following year, when he was confined to debtor's prison and all his unsold stock was taken by James Jones, who sold the remainder book from his little stall in Smithfield. And among the 20 books he took from Keymer were a dozen titles with false imprints, including, you guessed it, the Amsterdam Cat. Now, forgive me for getting a little into the weeds here. I know this material can be knotty, but I do think it's important. Here's one reason why. Keymer had a distinctive house style. His pamphlets all tend to look a certain way, and in part this is because Keymer kept a large stock of ornaments conveniently to hand. So almost all of his works in 1714 were printed with this particular headpiece and a little factotum made from smaller fleurons. This is a very standard characteristic example. His anonymous pamphlets looked very different. They never appeared with a headpiece, and instead featured improvised arrangements of smaller ornaments at the top of the page. And these arrangements are never reused across jobs. The Cat's a very good example of this. And so we see that fake or misleading imprints are accompanied by some form of evasive typography. Now, the relative success of this precaution is difficult to judge. In the spring of 1715, Keymer would be arrested and examined concerning the publishing and dispersing a certain scandalous pamphlet reflecting upon the royal family. And the title of the offending pamphlet is not given in the warrant, so it's impossible to identify with absolute certainty. But the description certainly sounds an awful lot like the Monarchomac Amsterdam Cat. Both Darby and Keymer used Amsterdam imprints in ways that simultaneously covered their tracts and encoded their publications with this additional layer of Republican symbolism. Readers were alert to the resonance of a false location, as the hostile responses to both printers demonstrate. But it was also possible to use dates in suggestive ways. For instance, the colophon to this single sheet pamphlet, called The True Patriot's Speech to the People of Rome, reads Amsterdam, printed in the year 1656. Well, that's a lie. The pamphlet was actually printed in London in December 1708 and was quickly interpreted, according to one contemporary reader, as a most malicious and seditious libel on the present government. Now, on its face, the decision to backdate a pamphlet looks like a sensible precaution. From the perspective of the government, if this work had been printed 52 years earlier, well, there'd be no point whatsoever in attempting to trace the author or the printer, who would probably be dead. But on closer inspection, I think this date, just like the false Amsterdam location, lends the pamphlet an additional political resonance. In order to understand why this pamphlet looks the way it does, we need to step away from bibliography for a moment and take a quick detour down the road of intellectual history. The text comprised a bold new translation of Caius Memmius's speech denouncing corruption in ancient Rome, taken from Sallust's famed account of the Jugurthine War. In translation, this classical text was transformed into a vicious attack against the corruption of the newly ascendant Whig junto. It was a common opposition complaint that the junto had enriched itself at the expense of the nation and entrenched its power by loading Parliament with servile placemen. Memmius thus declares that some stand ought immediately to be made, some stop, if possible, to be put to the growing tyranny of this junto, so that the commons of Rome may never have to live under the heaviest and most arbitrary oppression of 5 or 6 of their own fellow subjects. Note the black letter emphasis there. Believe it or not, the word junto isn't in Sallust's original. But in the context of the junto returning to power, well, the immediate topical significance of this text is difficult to miss. But the language of this translation also drew on the Commonwealth theorists of the 17th century, who had in turn, of course, been deeply influenced by Sallust. The speech of Memmius was particularly salient for Republican writers because it underscored that corrupt governments tarnish sick virtue. Having been dominated by the overbearing nobility of Rome, the plebs, Sallust suggests, had become servile and cowardly. And the point of this 1708 translation is therefore to suggest that England could witness an identical drift into slavery and bondage unless urgent action is taken to prevent the rise of the junto. Okay. By the early 18th century, this school of republican virtue was most closely associated with the writings of James Harrington, for whom Sallust was a key source. And I think false 1656 state of the true patriot's speech gestures to this tradition. For Harrington's masterwork, The Commonwealth of Oceania, was first published in that year, as was Marchmont Needham's The Excellency of a Free State, another key text in that Commonwealth tradition. And indeed, I'm not alone in this, the classicist Peter Culhane having made a similar point in a very interesting essay on Sallust. No less a historian than Quentin Skinner has declared the year 1656 to be the culminating moment in the emergence of a full-scale republican theory of freedom. The imprint of the true patriot's speech thus suggested that it belonged to that crucial moment in the history of political thought, when it was actually bringing an established theory of republican freedom into dialogue with contemporary political events. And just as this oppositional translation of Sallust would redeploy the earlier language of Harrington against the modern Whig establishment, so too the ideas contained in the true patriot's speech would later be recycled against the corrupt oligarchy of Robert Walpole. In 1728, an extract from the true patriot's speech, exhumed from a collection of pamphlets in the Bodleian and reprinted in the Craftsman as a prescient invention against the corruption of the times. This entire political thought is neatly captured in that single line of text. Amsterdam, printed in the year 1656. I want to close this paper by coming full circle and thinking about how these false imprints could be used by readers. In the spring of 1705, Defoe published an interesting little satire called The Diet of Poland, written to bolster opinion of the government in the provinces. As the poem appeared under the alias Angli Polowski, so too it falsely claimed to have been printed at Danzig. Well, here's what one of Defoe's great antagonists, the Tory pamphleteer William Pittis, had to say about that. But, say the dissenters, what relation have the transaction of Poland to us? This book was printed at Danzig. Look at the title page, else, and believe your own eyes. Our ministers of state and courts of justice have nothing to do with what is done in an independent kingdom. This, replies Pittis, we are willing to grant. But suppose this libel could be proved, as some persons know it can, to be printed in Bartholomew Close, dispersed secretly and clandestinely by such and such parties, to be left at particular coffee houses and taverns. Well, Pittis is expecting his readers to join the dots. When he claimed the diet to have been printed in Bartholomew Close, he was laying blame at the door of our old friend John Darby, hence coming full circle. He was arguing that in order to understand this pamphlet, you need to understand where it really came from, not just where it says it comes from. The great irony here is that Darby had nothing whatsoever to do with this. In truth, the Diet of Poland to be printed by John Barber, an up-and-coming printer who'd later make his name producing Tory propaganda for Swift and the Harley Ministry. Now, I think this particular case is a particularly useful one to end on. Firstly, because it shows how underground printers could slip the net. Pittis didn't guess that Barber was responsible. Moreover, Barber used an ornament on the title page that he only ever used for anonymous publications. It's an ornament that couldn't be traced or connected to any book with his legitimate imprint. Sneaky. We've already seen Darby and Kemah doing something similar with their books. Now, the second reason I think it's important is because this book illustrates how false imprints could be used by readers. Pittis complained about Whig readers blustering that the Danzig imprint proved the book couldn't be a satire on English affairs of state. They knew the imprint was false, he claimed, but it was false in a way that was very useful to them. But of course, the anonymous printing also proved useful to Pittis, because he could claim that the book came from the radical printer of Bartholomew Close and was thus part of a much broader and more insidious campaign of Whig propaganda. Perhaps he believed it, perhaps not. Either way, it's a convenient fiction. Moreover, it's the kind of fiction that could only be conjured up by a reader highly attuned not just to the bookish materiality of texts, but also to the textuality of the material book. In the age of the ESTC and ECHO, and metadata drawn from imprints, it's all too easy to forget that bookish bibliographical state of mind that early 18th century readers had, for whom these pamphlets were not static, lifeless objects, but living, breathing interventions to be viewed with suspicion and skepticism. A lot's been said in recent years about what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur famously termed a hermeneutics of suspicion, with scholars such as Tom Kemah documenting how conditions of censorship prompted authors to strategies of evasion and misdirection, in turn embedding a suspicion of surface meaning into readers. What we're seeing here is the bibliographical equivalent, the suspicion that a book, not just a text, might not be all it claims. That suspicion, that wariness, is a state of mind that we do well not only to remember, but to adopt ourselves. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. That was such a terrific paper in all sorts of ways. Not least your grasp of animations in PowerPoint. I wonder, would people like to just take to one of the great pities of these seminars is that you can't clap quite as easily as normally, but you're very welcome. We can take a little bit of time perhaps just to put appreciation in the chat for that wonderful rich paper while I talk to people about how we go about the Q&A session at ODSECS. So there's two different ways to ask a question. You're very welcome either to pop your question in the chat or down at the bottom of your screen you will probably see a little icon next to the microphone and camera icon of somebody putting their hand up, and if you use that then I'll be able to spot that you have done so. So please feel free to do either of those things to ask a question. While we're gathering our thoughts and our questions together, I wonder if I could just ask about those ornaments, which are amazing, and so much good work has been done with ornaments in recent years. I'm thinking about things like Hazel Wilkinson's brilliant project, which is not called Fleuron anymore, which is called Compositor, I think, and lots of exciting work on the kind of visuals of books. Is that something that 18th century readers, the 18th century authorities also noticed? Did they twig that there was something distinctive going on with the ornaments? Is there any evidence in trials or in state papers or anything? Oh, Joe, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, there are a couple of interesting examples from the later 17th century. Perhaps not representative examples. So we know that Roger Lestrange, when he's hunting down printers like a bloodhound, that he does go looking for ornaments, and he does think of ornaments as a kind of clinching piece of evidence. There's also the case of William Anderton in the 1690s, who's the second to last printer to be executed. And he is convicted because of ornaments and typography, which are brought in as evidence against him. More generally, though, this isn't something that you see kind of everyday readers or even polemical respondents talking about. They might mention in general that they bought pamphlets from people associated with printers. So I think there's a kind of social dimension that's completely lost to us now, right? We've got the physical evidence left before us, but we can't go around asking questions to people. Whereas actually what they're doing is picking up on gossip. And that, I think, is a kind of underutilized bibliographical resource. I think we should be far more alert to picking up on gossip from the early 18th century, as harnessing our analysis of typography and things to what rumors are flying around.
Absolutely, those hints that are such an important part of what we'll talk about. Fantastic. I can see a question that's come in from Carole Williams. What's the title of the book with a bookshelf full of political tracts in the background of the picture? She says, I'm doing some research on dramatic representations of spiritual beings, and she's interested in that fury.
So the original one is called Guess at My Meaning. Guess with double S at the end. I can't remember what the one with the fury is called, but if you type it into the British Museum image search, then you should be able to find it with Guess at My Meaning. Hope that helps.
Brilliant, thank you. Are there other questions? Sometimes it takes a little while for my computer to pick up the fact that somebody's got their hands up. So I will just wait to see whether that settles. John, I can see your hand is up.
Sorry to bookend the talk. That was brilliant, Joe. Thank you. I guess we think, or I think, of false imprints as something that belongs to controversial writing, which is obviously partly your wheelhouse, and that's where you come across it. I guess Leviathan suggests that the sort of controversial, right? It's political, but I'm wondering if you found any evidence that it's practiced in kind of quite much more distant genres, different kinds of writing, or is it really centered on controversial stuff? I guess it's not really fair because controversial writing is quite a broad category, really.
Yeah. Well, if you expand controversial to include pornographic, then yes. I mean, there's David Foxon's amazing book on libertine literature, which goes into a lot of detail on that. The Leviathan question is a really interesting one, because I really do see that as a forgery, in essence. It's a fake first edition, and that's kind of my next project that I'm starting to think about, is the forgery of first editions by printers across the longue durée. And actually there's a lot of that going on, where people are putting false imprints onto books that they're essentially not allowed to sell. They're piracies. So very lucrative titles you'll often see pirated with false imprints slapped on the front. So it's essentially, if you expand your category of the false imprint to include the copy, the fake, then yeah, it happens all over the place. Particularly things like bestsellers, and Stationers Company, exclusive English stock items.
Fantastic, thank you. Question coming in from Alan through the chat. So you didn't mention much about paper sources and watermarks. How did they place into the identification of texts? Was there evasive paper usage?
Great question. I don't think so. I think that it's the kind of thing that company officials are picking up on when they're finding piracies of texts. That's often their big complaint, is they'll say that the paper quality of this is garbage. This shouldn't be sold as this particular version of this particular book. That somehow the paper quality is very much wrapped up with English stock items in particular, so Bibles, primers, almanacs. There's no attempt made to match, the authentic version. So I wonder whether or not there's a kind of the flip side of that, is that actually people would straight away realize that they're not handling an authentic item as soon as they pick it up. Might say that this is a Jacob Tonson version of a play, but they know it wasn't just by feeling it. This is something that David Francis Taylor, I think, has talked about with Addison's plays quite recently, which he's editing, saying that there are certain fabrications and piracies that you could just tell by the paper aren't the original. That tactile aspect is, I think, really, really important, but it's not something that many printers are trying to match.
Great, thank you. A question from Morteza. So my question is that if there was any link between the ornaments and like their shape or their style and the themes, subjects or content of the books that you've examined. That's a really interesting question, I guess, about whether ornaments are illustrative in some way.
Yeah, and it's at the upper end of the market, absolutely. But for this kind of thing, there's a sense that you have your stock and that's what you use on everything, because they're pricey, right? You've got to use them as much as you can if you've chucked out the money on them. I think ultimately you can sometimes read too much into ornaments, unless of course you've got a special example of someone like Pope who is designing them himself. There are people who are doing really great work on the potential resonances of ornaments, though, especially Hazel Wilkinson, who Rebecca's already mentioned.
Great, thank you. Question from Markman. Great paper, Joe. Thanks so much. At one point you said an imprint like sold by the booksellers of London or printed in the year 17 whatever was meaningless. But what meaning, instrumental or evasive, did it have on the title page? That is, why include it at all if it has no meaning? What did this sort of phrasing advertise to the only slightly aware reader?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's something that I am thinking about quite a bit, actually, especially the sold by the booksellers of Westminster and London one. If you're seeing the imprint, then you've probably bought a book from one of the booksellers of Westminster or London. It seems completely redundant. I think, at least in part, it's a kind of gesture to say, look, we know we're supposed to put these imprints on books, so we're going to do the absolute bare minimum. At least there's something on the title page, even if it's completely inadequate. There's also, when it comes to something like printed in the year 1705 or whatever, you're trying to make sure that people know it's a new book. That's an important thing. But if you're selling topical controversial literature, then you want people to know it's up to date. And that's often why, especially in later months in a year, while you'll often have printed in the year 1706 for something that's printed in November 1705. So besides those evasive maneuvers that are going on, there are also kind of attempts to make sure that the currency of a book is as live as possible. But it's a really important issue, and I'm glad you brought it up, Mark. Thanks.
Great. Question from Nick. What do you think of the flip side to all this sort of honest title pages, so title pages that bespeak probity, brazenness, and so on? I remember there was some surprise that Steele was happy to put his name to his tracts in 1713-14.
Yeah, and I think that's another really good point. It's not something I've spent a huge amount of time looking at because, like like a lot of literary scholars, I'm interested in puzzles, and in some ways that brazenness is almost an attempt to say, look, we're not giving you the puzzle to riddle out, they're taking away the fun of it. But there is something quite courageous going on there, or there's something just quite ignorant going on. So often printers who do put their, have their name on the front of, the crisis. I don't think the Steele pamphlet is a good example of this, because I think the printer says when he's asked by Parliament, well, I didn't read it. Oh, I thought it was innocent. And if I thought it's innocent, I'd put my name on it. Therefore, I can't be guilty. So there's a double-edged thing there. If you're not putting your name on it, you sort of know that you shouldn't be printing it in the first place. Whereas at least if you put your name on it, you can say, I've got the wrong idea at the wrong end of the stick. So yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, Nick. Thanks for bringing it up.
That's terrific. Question from Kim Simpson. I wondered what this means for how books are catalogued on things like the ESTC or in databases like EBO or ECHO for that matter. Are there efforts being made to note where the information given is false? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think a really important question as well at the moment when we're encountering these texts, usually in an online format. To give you an example of how badly wrong this can go, the True Patriot Speech pamphlet, the Salus translation, well, of course, that's not in ECHO because it says it's printed in 1656, so it's in EBO. Something as simple as that means that you encounter it in a very different context. There needs, and I think the fact that everything now draws on the ESTC, that metadata is all drawn from the ESTC. Where does the ESTC get its information from? It gets its information from Imprints. And ultimately, it's the old thing of garbage in, garbage out. If the information in the imprint is false, then it's going to make its way all the way through into things like EBO and ECHO. So far as I know, there are no coherent efforts being made other than ad hoc writing in to the ESTC saying you've listed this wrong or whatever. And I'll sometimes write to booksellers and who put on a new catalogue saying that a certain book, it's almost always the big Milton Amsterdam edition of 1698 that everyone says first edition printed in Amsterdam, which is of course not true. So these things, it can have a really distorting effect. Some effort does need to be made to correct this information at the source, and that means going back over the ESTC.
Great. And a question from Dylan Lewis. So what are the typical methods for detection at our disposal for recognising and correcting false imprints when the evasion is perhaps not obvious, or the evasion is obvious but it's unclear who was actually behind the text's production?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are essentially two things you can do, especially with false dates, and that's looking at ownership marks. For starters, that's how Noel Malcolm found out that the later edition of Leviathan wasn't the 1651 edition, because the earliest ownership inscription was 1702, whereas all the other editions or versions of the first edition, as it were, all had earlier marks on them. From that, you then proceed to look at things, advertisements, gossip in newspapers, responses in polemical pamphlet literature. I think that the important thing is not to wedge yourself to one particular method or technique. It's to be omnivorous, to look at everything, to find anything you can about these books, and then you can narrow down the field to do your bibliographical analysis, to look at your ornaments and your broken type and that sort of thing. Because frankly, unless you narrow down the field beforehand, it's looking for a needle in a haystack. As for the second part of the question, finding out who's actually behind the text production, well, yeah, like I say, it's a matter of narrowing down the field before you start to compare ornaments and type. But often it's just having something at the back of your head, just being able to think, I've seen that somewhere before. And Hazel Wilkinson's compositor database is now changing that for the 18th century in particular. And if you haven't tried it out, it's amazing. Have a go. Annoyingly, of course, it doesn't have anything before 1701, and I've been mostly looking at the 1690s at the moment. So I've been doing things the old-fashioned way, but Hazel's made it much quicker.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question, perhaps the last question actually, from Stephen Carrion. Do you think the trends that you explored change after the 1695 to 1715 period that you focused on? I'm wondering if the growing use of trade publishers, as well as the increasingly centralised wealth in the London book trade, began to limit these trends.
Yeah, to an extent. I think two things go on, particularly with the kind of real consolidation of trade publishers as a major force in the industry. One is that because their names appear so often in imprints, we have no real idea as to whether or not it's true, whether or not a trade publisher was actually involved, because a trade publisher had no involvement in the printing process. There's testimony from John Morphew saying that the way that pamphlets were dropped off at his house, his workshop, or not workshop, warehouse, he never knew who they were from before they were delivered. He didn't have any involvement in printing them whatsoever. So by whose authority would the name J. Morphew be in the imprint? It's only the printer. And likewise, there's a Swift example that John's talked about, the partridge hoaxes. They all say that they're sold by Abigail Baldwin. Says who? They're never advertised by her. Her name's in the imprint, but how do we know? How do we know that she actually had any involvement? We don't. So I think actually that things like the rise of trade publishers is actually based on imprints. It's the main evidential kind of basis. And I don't think those imprints are necessarily as reliable as we've been led to believe, which means we might have to rethink our ideas about just how important trade publishers were, if that sort of makes sense. But you've also still got a very active liminal book trade. You've got people like Francis Clifton in the 1720s who are just churning out stuff with false imprints all the time. The state papers are littered with his ballads, none of which have his name on the title page, and he constantly uses other people's names all the time without their permission. So I think it really does continue much later than perhaps we tend to realise.
It's fascinating. And a real last question from Daniel Cook, which came in just as I was saying that the last one was the last question. So is there any evidence of authors taking advantage of the false imprints market, as it were, sort of playing publishers off against each other?
I don't know about playing publishers off against each other, but authors are certainly, especially authors who we think of as being playful with print, are certainly using false imprints a lot. The Dunciad's the most famous example, with Anne Dodd on the title page when she had nothing to do with it whatsoever. And again, Swift with Abigail Baldwin, I don't think that she had anything to do with those particular broadsides, but there's no way of proving it. All we know is what the imprint says. But so yeah, I think authors could get playful with imprints.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joe. What a wonderful paper and question session, and fantastic questions. Thank you very much, everybody. Feel free to take to the chat to give a virtual round of applause to our wonderful speaker. Joe, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope you'll join us next time, which is going to be on Friday the 26th of February at the same time of day as this one, whatever time that is for you. Julie Park of New York University will be speaking to us about the camera obscura and built environments of inner life in 18th century England, which promises to be a really wonderful paper. So we look forward to seeing you then. The recording of this session will be up on YouTube shortly after the event, so do pass the link on to anybody who you think would enjoy the talk but hasn't been able to be with us this evening. And Joe, final thanks to you again. Many, many thanks for
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for coming along.
Okay, bye now.